For most of us, our knowledge of drug cartels begins and ends with shows like Narcos and Breaking Bad. Tales of ambitious kingpins rising from nothing to build sprawling criminal empires. But while Hollywood gives us the glamour, the real story of these organizations is far more complex and reaches back much further than most realize. It's a tale that begins not with drugs at all, but with a simple desire for protection and justice in the chaos of 19th century Mexico. So today, we're diving deep into the shadows with the history of some of the most notorious cartels that shaped the modern drug trade. But before we get buried under too many names and territories, make sure you've subscribed to Crime Republic, hit the bell, and let us know in the comments what other criminal enterprises you'd like us to explore. Okay, now to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution in the 1920s. In the northern states of Mexico, particularly Sinaloa, local farmers formed armed groups called autodefensas, self-defense forces meant to protect their communities from bandits and corrupt officials. It's ironic that these organizations, formed to protect people from criminals, would evolve into the very thing they were created to fight. But the real transformation began during Prohibition in the United States. These farmers realized they could make more money smuggling alcohol across the border than growing legitimate crops. When Prohibition ended, they didn't just pack up and go home. They had built sophisticated smuggling networks and weren't about to let them go to waste. Instead, they shifted to marijuana and opium, setting the stage for what would become the modern cartel system. Let's start with the organization that would become the gold standard of drug trafficking, the Sinaloa Cartel. But to tell their story properly, we need to meet Pedro Avilés Pérez, known as El León de la Sierra, the Lion of the Mountains. In the 1960s, Avilés created the first sophisticated drug trafficking network in Sinaloa, using light aircraft to transport marijuana into the United States. He was essentially the godfather of modern drug trafficking, mentoring future kingpins like Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, who would later become known as El Padrino, the Godfather. Félix Gallardo would go on to create the Guadalajara Cartel, the organization that would eventually splinter into many of today's major cartels. Think of it as the criminal equivalent of AT&T breaking up into the Baby Bells, except with a lot more bloodshed. Under his leadership, the operation expanded beyond marijuana into cocaine trafficking, forming crucial partnerships with Colombian cartels, particularly Pablo Escobar's Medellin organization. But the real game-changer came in 1989, when Félix Gallardo was arrested. His empire was divided into territories, with the Tijuana route going to the Arellano Félix brothers, Juarez to the Carrillo Fuentes family, and Sinaloa to a group that included Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. This splintering would set off decades of brutal turf wars that continue to this day. The Sinaloa Cartel, under El Chapo's leadership, would grow into what many consider the largest drug trafficking organization in history. We're talking about an estimated annual revenue of $3 billion, and that's just the conservative estimate. Some experts put it closer to $11 billion. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the GDP of several small countries. But it wasn't just about the money. The Sinaloa Cartel revolutionized drug trafficking with innovations like using submarines to transport cocaine, building elaborate tunnel networks under the US-Mexico border, and even developing their own encrypted communications systems. They didn't just break the mold, they created a new one. The cartel's sophistication extended to their business model. They operated like a franchise, allowing local criminals to use their name and networks in exchange for a cut of the profits. Think McDonald's, but for drug trafficking. This approach allowed them to expand rapidly while minimizing risk to the core organization. But if the Sinaloa Cartel wrote the book on modern drug trafficking, the Medellín Cartel wrote the preface. Let's go back to Colombia in the 1970s. Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers weren't just drug traffickers. They were pioneers who transformed cocaine from a niche product into a global commodity. At its peak in the mid-1980s, the Medellín Cartel was earning an estimated $60 million per day. That's about $420 million in today's money. Escobar became so wealthy that he allegedly wrote off $2.1 billion in cash each year due to damage from rats eating the bills or water damage in their storage facilities. The cartel was spending $1,000 per week just on rubber bands to wrap their stacks of cash. But here's where it gets interesting. The Medellin Cartel didn't just sell drugs. They created an entire parallel economy. They built housing projects, football fields, and schools. Pablo Escobar even got himself elected as an alternate congressman. It was a level of social and political infiltration that would become a template for future cartels. The cartel's operations were staggering in scale. They owned an entire fleet of aircraft, including 15 Boeing 727s. They controlled their own shipping company, their own security force, and even their own assassination squad, known as Los Sicarios. At one point, they were importing so much cocaine into the United States that they had to buy a firebombing company in Louisiana just to have a front for purchasing the massive amounts of fuel they needed. But success breeds competition, and the Medellin Cartel's dominance would be challenged by the Cali Cartel, leading to one of the bloodiest periods in Colombia's history. The war between these organizations would claim thousands of lives, including police officers, judges, journalists, and countless innocent civilians. The violence reached such levels that Colombia became known as the murder capital of the world. Now, let's fast forward to the late 1990s and meet an organization that would redefine cartel violence, Los Zetas. Their story begins with the Gulf Cartel, another powerhouse that deserves its own chapter in this dark history. The Gulf Cartel, founded by Juan Nepomuceno Guerra in the 1930s, started as a smuggling operation during Prohibition. By the 1970s, under the leadership of Juan Garcia Abrego, they had grown into a major drug trafficking organization with estimated annual revenues of $2 billion. But their most significant, and ultimately most dangerous innovation, was recruiting 31 elite members of Mexico's special forces to serve as their enforcement arm. These weren't just ordinary soldiers. They were members of GAFE, Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, trained by the U.S. Army's 7th Special Forces Group and Israel's Defense Forces. They brought military precision to cartel warfare, introducing tactics like sophisticated communications jamming, coordinated attacks, and the use of military-grade weapons. But in 2010, Los Zetas broke away from the Gulf Cartel, leading to a war that would transform northeastern Mexico into a battlefield. The violence was unprecedented. In the city of San Fernando, Los Zetas massacred 72 migrants who refused to work for them. They regularly engaged in mass kidnappings, public executions, and would dump bodies in city centers as warnings to their rivals. The Zetas Gulf Cartel War would have ripple effects throughout Mexico's criminal landscape. Other cartels began recruiting their own military-trained enforcement units. The Sinaloa Cartel formed Los Antrax, while the Jalisco New Generation Cartel created their own Special Forces-style unit. It was an arms race that would militarize cartel violence to unprecedented levels. Speaking of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, they're worth a mention as they represent the next evolution in cartel operations. Formed from the ashes of the Medellín Cartel after its leader's arrest in 2009, CJNG has grown into one of Mexico's most powerful and violent criminal organizations. Their annual revenue is estimated at $20 billion, and they've shown a willingness to directly confront Mexican security forces, even shooting down military helicopters with RPGs. Now let's turn our attention to the Juarez Cartel, whose story is inextricably linked with one of the most dangerous cities in the world, Ciudad Juarez. Under the leadership of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, the organization revolutionized drug transportation. Carrillo Fuentes bought a fleet of used 727s to transport cocaine from Colombia to Mexico, earning an estimated $25 billion over his career. But the real story of the Juarez Cartel is their war with the Sinaloa Cartel for control of the city. From 2008 to 2012, Ciudad Juarez became the murder capital of the world, with over 10,000 people killed in drug-related violence. The conflict introduced new levels of brutality, with bodies being dissolved in acid, public executions, and the targeting of journalists and police officers. This brings us to an often overlooked aspect of cartel operations: their impact on legitimate businesses. The cartels have infiltrated everything from avocado farming to mining. The Sinaloa Cartel, for example, has significant investments in construction companies, restaurants, and even daycare centers. It's estimated that drug trafficking organizations launder between $19 billion and $29 billion through Mexico's legitimate economy each year. But perhaps the most significant evolution in cartel operations has been their move into synthetic drugs, particularly fentanyl. The Sinaloa Cartel and CJNG have established sophisticated networks to import precursor chemicals from China, set up labs in Mexico, and distribute the final product throughout the United States. This shift has made them more profitable than ever, with fentanyl's low production costs and high profit margins. The modern cartel landscape is more complex than ever. The old hierarchical structures are giving way to more fragmented organizations. The capture of El Chapo didn't end the Sinaloa Cartel. It just led to internal competition between his sons, Los Chapitos, and veteran leader Ismael El Mayo Zambada. The same pattern has played out with other organizations. When leaders fall instead of collapse, we see splintering and evolution. These organizations have also adapted to new technologies. They use drones for surveillance and smuggling, cryptocurrency for money laundering, and social media for intimidation and recruitment. They've even developed their own encrypted communication networks and use sophisticated financial instruments to move money around the globe. The numbers are staggering. The United Nations estimates that drug trafficking generates $426 billion annually worldwide, with Mexican cartels controlling about a third of this market. They've built shadow economies that rival legitimate industries, with complex supply chains, quality control systems, and even customer service operations. But the human cost is even more staggering. Since 2006, when Mexico launched its war on drugs, over 350,000 people have been killed in cartel-related violence. Entire communities have been displaced, local economies destroyed, and democratic institutions undermined. The cartels have created what some experts call criminal insurgencies, where they effectively control territory and provide services normally associated with government. In 2016, when El Chapo was finally captured, investigators found evidence that the cartel had infiltrated multiple levels of government, from local police chiefs to federal congressmen. They weren't just bribing officials, they were placing their own people in positions of power. It was like having a shadow government operating alongside the legitimate one. The Gulf Cartel wrote the blueprint for political corruption in Mexico. Back in the 1970s, under Juan Garcia Abrego, they pioneered what became known as the Plaza system. Imagine a franchise system, but for corruption. Each territory, or plaza, had its designated officials who received regular payments. Police commanders, judges, mayors. Everyone had their price, and the Gulf Cartel was happy to pay it. But perhaps the most sophisticated political operation was run by the Juarez Cartel under Amado Carrillo Fuentes. The Lord of the Skies didn't just buy politicians, he created them. The cartel would identify promising young politicians early in their careers, fund their campaigns, and gradually build a network of loyal public servants. By the mid-1990s, they had their people in every level of government in Chihuahua State. The political influence of these cartels extends far beyond Mexico. Take the case of the Medellin Cartel. Pablo Escobar didn't just get himself elected as an alternate congressman, he fundamentally changed Colombia's constitution. In 1991, he successfully lobbied to ban extradition, showing just how far cartel influence could reach. The cartel would literally change the laws of the land to protect their interests, but Escobar's political influence came at a price. When he couldn't buy politicians, he buried them. The cartel's infamous policy of plata o plomo, silver or lead, reached its peak in 1989 when they assassinated presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán. This wasn't just murder. It was a direct assault on Colombia's democracy. The message was clear: cross the cartel, and no position was too high to protect you. Let's fast forward to the modern era, where Los Zetas rewrote the rules of political influence. Unlike their predecessors who preferred to work behind the scenes, Los Zetas took a more direct approach. In states like Tamaulipas and Coahuila, they didn't just infiltrate the government. They became the government. Between 2007 and 2017, they effectively controlled entire police forces, using them as their own private army. According to Mexican government investigations, Los Zetas had over 70% of municipal police forces on their payroll in territories they controlled. But it went beyond local law enforcement. In 2013, investigators uncovered evidence that the cartel had infiltrated state agencies to the point where they could access official databases, track potential threats, and even issue legitimate government documents. But it seems the most impactful political operation in recent years belongs to the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. They've taken political manipulation to the digital age. In the 2018 Mexican elections, intelligence agencies detected a massive social media campaign run by CJNG-affiliated groups. They weren't just buying votes, they were shaping public opinion through sophisticated disinformation campaigns. The cartel's political influence extends into the United States as well. In 2019, investigators uncovered evidence that the Sinaloa Cartel had infiltrated U.S. border protection agencies. They weren't just bribing individual agents. They had developed a systematic approach to compromising entire departments. According to court documents, they would identify vulnerable agents, start with small favors, and gradually escalate until the officials were completely compromised. But it's at the local level where cartel political influence is most insidious. Take the case of Michoacán State, where cartels have effectively created parallel governments. They collect taxes, maintain infrastructure, and even operate their own justice system. In some communities, if you have a dispute with your neighbor, you're more likely to go to the cartel for resolution than the official courts. The impact on democratic institutions has been devastating. In the 2021 Mexican midterm elections, over 30 politicians were killed, making it one of the bloodiest election seasons in recent history. But violence is just one tool in their arsenal. Cartels have become sophisticated political operators, using everything from campaign financing to social media manipulation to achieve their goals. Consider the case of the Sinaloa Cartel's operation in Guatemala. Through a combination of bribes, threats, and strategic alliances, they managed to create what investigators called a parallel state within certain regions. They didn't just control drug routes, they influenced everything from judicial appointments to infrastructure projects. It was governance by cartel proxy. The political influence extends to the highest levels of government. In 2019, former Mexican Secretary of Public Security Genaro Garcia Luna was arrested in the United States, accused of taking millions in bribes from the Sinaloa Cartel. This wasn't just any official. This was Mexico's equivalent of the head of the FBI, allegedly working for the very organizations he was supposed to be fighting. So what's the future of these organizations? As we've seen, taking down kingpins doesn't destroy cartels, it just forces them to evolve. They're already using artificial intelligence for route planning, blockchain technology for money laundering, and even developing their own software for operational security. The reality is that as long as there's demand for illegal drugs, these organizations will exist in some form. They've shown a remarkable ability to adapt and evolve, turning every challenge into an opportunity for innovation. From humble beginnings as farmers protecting their communities, they've transformed into sophisticated criminal enterprises that challenge the very notion of state authority. So what do you think? How do we address this seemingly unstoppable force? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into the dark side of the drug trade interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to stay updated on more stories from the shadows of crime. See you next time.